The scent of burning cedar and wild roses filled the grand hall, thick enough to coat my tongue with bitterness I couldn't swallow. Candles flickered in iron sconces along stone walls that had witnessed 1,000 ceremonies just like this one, celebrations of power, of destiny, of bonds that would shape the future of our kind. But tonight, the ancient ritual felt different. The air itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, heavy and electric, as if the stones knew something terrible was about to unfold. I stood at the very edge of the gathered crowd, pressed so far into the shadows that the candlelight barely touched my pale hair. It was safer here, in the margins, where no one would notice the Omega who didn't belong. Where no one would remember that 3 months ago I had stood in a very different position, closer to the center, closer to hope, closer to a life that had been ripped away, with words that still echoed in my dreams. I, Demon Corvus, reject you as my mate. My hand instinctively moved to my chest, fingers curling against the fabric of my simple gray dress, as if I could press the memory back down, keep it buried where it couldn't hurt anymore. But pain like that doesn't fade. It settles into your bones, becomes part of your architecture, reshapes you from the inside out, until you're not sure who you were before it carved its mark into your soul. Tonight was the lunar binding, the ceremony where our new Luna would be formally presented to the pack, where she would accept her role as the Alpha King's chosen mate before the entire kingdom. Every pack from the northern territories had sent representatives, their most important members dressed in velvet and silk, their wolves barely contained beneath expensive cologne and practiced smiles. The hierarchy was visible in every detail. The strongest stood closest to the raised dais. The most influential wore the richest colors. And Omegas like me, especially rejected, broken Omegas like me, disappeared into the background like ghosts no one wanted to acknowledge. I shouldn't have come. My friend Senna had begged me to stay away, her dark eyes filled with the kind of worry that comes from caring too much. "It'll only hurt worse," she'd whispered yesterday, her hand squeezing mine in the small kitchen we shared in the Omega quarters. Watching him with her, seeing what you could have had, but she didn't understand, couldn't understand, because I hadn't come to torture myself with what I'd lost. I'd come because of what I'd heard. The memory surfaced sharp and clear. 2 nights ago, I'd been walking back from the healing halls where I worked sorting herbs and preparing remedies. The senior healers never let me touch the patients. Too weak, too unreliable, tainted by rejection. But I was good with plants, with knowing which roots would draw out fever and which flowers would ease pain. It gave me purpose when everything else had been stripped away. I'd taken the long path through the East Gardens, the one that curved behind the Luna's private chambers. Not because I wanted to see where Demon's new mate lived, but because the night-blooming jasmine grew thick there, and its scent reminded me of my mother. She'd died when I was 12, a fever that spread too quickly for even the best healers to stop. And sometimes, I needed that fragrant reminder that I'd once been loved unconditionally. That's when I'd heard them. 2 voices, low and urgent, drifting through an open window. I'd frozen behind a marble column, my heart hammering against my ribs, every instinct screaming at me to run. Omegas caught eavesdropping faced severe punishment. Our kind was meant to be seen and not heard, certainly never privy to private conversations of our betters, but something in the tone stopped me. Fear, conspiracy, the particular cadence of people planning something they knew was wrong. "The Eastern Scouts won't suspect anything," the first voice had said, female, cultured, with an accent that placed her from the coastal territories. "They're loyal to tradition, not to him specifically. When the attack comes during tomorrow night's hunt, they'll assume it's the rogues from the borderlands. And the king?" The second voice was male, deeper, uncertain. "He's not easy to kill, even with the element of surprise. He'll be vulnerable." The female voice cut in sharply. "Trust me. Everything is arranged. By the time they realize what's happening, it will be too late. The crown will pass exactly where it should have gone in the first place." My blood had turned to ice in my veins. They were planning to kill the Alpha King. Not in honorable combat, not through challenge as our laws demanded, but through deception and ambush. Murder dressed up as accident. I'd fled then, my soft footsteps silent on the garden path, my mind racing with impossible choices. Who could I tell? Who would believe an Omega, especially one marked by rejection? And more terrifyingly, what if the conspiracy went deeper than two voices in the dark? What if guards were compromised, advisors bought, the very structure of power rotted from within? The question that had haunted me most, the one that kept me awake as I stared at my ceiling, counting the hours until this ceremony. Was the Luna herself involved? Now, standing in the grand hall as the ceremonial drums began their deep, rhythmic pulse, I searched the crowd for answers written in faces and body language. The Eastern Scouts stood in formation near the main entrance, 30 warriors in ceremonial armor, their expressions proud and alert. They didn't look like conspirators. They looked like men who would die for their king without hesitation. My gaze drifted upward to the dais where 2 thrones sat carved from ancient oak, their backs inlaid with silver moons. The smaller throne remained empty, waiting. But the larger one held the man who'd become legend even among our long-lived kind, Alpha King Caspian Silverthorn. I'd never been this close to him before. Even from my position in the shadows, I could feel the weight of his presence like a physical force. He sat utterly still, his body relaxed in that way only truly dangerous predators could achieve. The kind of stillness that came before explosive violence. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that could have been carved from the same stone as the walls around us, all sharp angles and harsh beauty. His eyes, silver like his name, surveyed the crowd with an intensity that made me want to hide deeper in the shadows. Everything about him spoke of power barely leashed, of authority that didn't need to announce itself, of a man who'd earned his crown through strength and strategy, who'd united fractious packs through a combination of fear and grudging respect. He terrified me, and I was about to risk everything to try to save him. The drums grew louder, and the crowd shifted, parting like water to create a pathway down the center of the hall. My breathing quickened. This was it. The moment when the Luna would make her entrance, when all eyes would turn to witness the future of our kingdom walk toward her destiny, when no one would be watching an invisible Omega slip through the crowd toward the dais. My hands were shaking. I pressed them against my thighs, feeling the small piece of folded paper hidden in the pocket of my dress. I'd spent an hour writing and rewriting those words, trying to convey urgency without seeming insane, warning without revealing how I knew. Your Luna set a trap. Leave now. 8 words that would either save a life or end mine. The ceremonial horns blared, their sound reverberating off the vaulted ceiling, and she appeared at the far end of the hall. Luna Seraphine Nightshade was exactly what an Alpha King's mate should be. Tall and elegant, her midnight hair cascading down her back in perfect waves, her emerald dress cut to display both modesty and the powerful body beneath. She was a beta of the highest rank, from a family whose bloodline traced back to the founding packs. Beautiful, educated, politically connected. Everything I was not. She moved down the aisle with perfect grace, her smile radiant, her eyes locked on the king who rose from his throne to receive her. The crowd murmured approval, a collective exhale of satisfaction that the natural order was being maintained, that their king had chosen wisely. I watched her face carefully, searching for any crack in that perfect mask. Did she know? Was she part of the conspiracy, or just a pawn being moved across someone else's board? Her smile never wavered, her steps never faltered. If she carried guilt or knowledge of betrayal, she hid it behind layers of breeding and training that I could never hope to match. The ceremony began with the traditional words, spoken by our eldest pack leader in the old tongue. I barely heard them. My entire focus had narrowed to a single point, getting that note into the king's hand without being stopped, without being seen, without triggering the very trap I was trying to warn him about. I waited until the blessing reached its crescendo, until every eye was fixed on the couple at the dais, until even the guards had shifted their attention forward. Then I moved. Each step felt like walking through deep water, resistance and fear making my limbs heavy. I kept my head down, my pale hair falling forward to partially obscure my face, my body language screaming submission and insignificance, just an Omega. Nothing to worry about, barely worth noticing. I made it halfway to the dais before someone grabbed my arm. "What are you doing?" The voice was harsh, male, belonging to a guard whose hand felt like an iron cuff around my bicep. Omegas aren't permitted near the— Please, I whispered, keeping my voice soft and desperate, not hard when my heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I just need to deliver something, a message. It's important. His grip tightened, and I felt my chance slipping away. In seconds, he'd drag me out, possibly throw me in the holding cells for disrupting a sacred ceremony. And whatever was going to happen would happen without warning, without hope of prevention. Desperation made me bold. I looked up, meeting his eyes directly, something Omegas were never supposed to do with higher ranks, and let him see the genuine terror in my expression. People will die, I breathed. Please. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm trying to stop it. Something in my face must have convinced him, because his grip loosened fractionally. What kind of message? Before I could answer, a voice cut through the ceremonial chanting like a blade through silk. Let her approach. Every head turned. The hall fell into immediate, suffocating silence. Alpha King Caspian Silverthorn was looking directly at me, his silver eyes pinning me in place with an intensity that made my knees weak. His hand had risen in a gesture that halted not just the guard, but every breath in the room. He'd noticed me, the invisible Omega in the shadows. He'd noticed, and now there was nowhere to hide. Come forward, he commanded, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent space. Not loud, but absolute. The kind of voice that didn't expect to be disobeyed. The guard released my arm immediately. The crowd parted, creating a pathway that felt like walking toward my execution. Luna Seraphine's perfect smile had frozen on her face, her green eyes tracking my movement with an expression I couldn't quite read. My legs barely supported me as I climbed the 3 steps to the dais. Up close, the king was even more overwhelming, taller than I'd realized, broader, his presence filling my entire field of vision. The scent of him hit me like a physical force. Pine and winter night, authority and something wild that made my Omega instincts scream in confused terror and recognition. I dropped into the lowest bow our kind knew, forehead nearly touching the stone floor, every line of my body screaming submission and respect. Speak. One word. A command wrapped in silk over steel. My hand trembled as I reached into my pocket, withdrew the folded paper. I didn't rise from my bow, couldn't make myself look at him again. Instead, I simply extended my arm, offering the note like a supplicant offering tribute to a deity. Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, I whispered, my voice barely audible, but you need to read this. Now. Before— His hand took the paper from my fingers, the brief brush of his skin against mine sending an electric shock up my arm that made no sense, that I had no time to process. I heard the soft sound of paper unfolding, felt the weight of his attention shift from me to the words I'd written. The silence stretched so long I thought my heart might simply stop from the pressure of it. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. Gone was the ceremonial tone, replaced by something harder, sharper, edged with cold fury. Who are you? I dared to lift my head just enough to see his face. His expression hadn't changed, still that carved marble perfection, but his eyes had transformed into chips of winter ice, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that promised either salvation or destruction. No one important, Your Majesty, I managed. Just someone who heard something she shouldn't have. Someone who couldn't stay silent. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then his gaze lifted, scanning the crowd with new purpose, new suspicion, and I realized with a jolt of horror that he believed me, which meant everything was about to change. Luna Seraphine took a small step forward, her melodious voice breaking the tension. My love, what is this? Some kind of disruption? Surely we shouldn't allow— The ceremony is postponed, Caspian announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Everyone will remain exactly where they are. Guards, seal the exits. No one leaves until I determine what truth lies in this warning. The hall erupted into confused murmurs. But beneath the sound, I heard something else. A subtle shift, a movement near the eastern entrance that didn't match the general confusion. And I realized with sickening certainty that I'd just triggered the very trap I'd tried to prevent. The chaos erupted faster than thought. One moment, The grand hall buzzed with confused whispers and shuffling feet as guards moved to seal the entrances. The next, the eastern wall exploded inward with a deafening crack that sent stone fragments flying like shrapnel through the air. I didn't think. My body simply reacted, diving sideways as a chunk of masonry crashed into the spot where I'd been standing. My shoulder hit the stone floor hard enough to steal my breath, and I rolled instinctively toward the base of the dais, making myself as small as possible while the world descended into screaming chaos. Through the gaping hole in the wall, figures poured in, not the rogues they'd planned to blame, but trained warriors in mismatched armor, their faces covered with dark cloth, their movements coordinated and purposeful, at least 20 of them, maybe more, spreading through the crowd like poison through water. The ceremonial guards reacted instantly, weapons appearing from beneath formal robes, their training overriding the shock. But I could see immediately that they were outnumbered, outpositioned. Whoever had planned this had known exactly where every defender would be standing, exactly how long it would take them to respond. Someone screamed, a high, piercing sound of genuine terror. The crowd fragmented into panic, nobles and warriors alike scrambling for the exits only to find them blocked by more attackers. It was a perfectly executed trap, designed to cage us all inside with death. "Protect the king!" someone roared, and I saw the royal guard forming a defensive circle around the dais, their bodies becoming living shields. But Caspian wasn't behind them. He'd moved forward, down the steps, his ceremonial robes already discarded to reveal the fighting leathers beneath. His transformation was instantaneous and terrifying, from seated authority to moving violence in the span of a heartbeat. His hand held a blade that seemed to have materialized from nowhere, its edge catching the candlelight as he moved to intercept the first wave of attackers. I'd never seen an Alpha King fight before. None of us had, really. His battles were legendary, but they happened on distant borders, in places common wolves never witnessed. Watching him now was like watching a storm given human form. He moved through the attackers with brutal efficiency, each strike precise and lethal, his body a weapon honed by decades of combat. 3 men fell before they'd even registered his approach. Another lost his blade and then his life in the space between breaths. There was no hesitation in him, no mercy, just cold calculation and overwhelming force. But even he couldn't be everywhere at once. An attacker broke through the defensive line, heading straight for the Eastern scouts who were trying to organize a counter-assault. I saw the blade in his hand, saw the way he moved with purpose toward Commander Ronan, the scout leader who'd served the king for 20 years, saw that no one else was positioned to stop him. My body moved before my mind could catch up, before fear could paralyze me, before common sense could remind me that I was an Omega, powerless, useless in a fight. I launched myself from my hiding spot at the base of the dais, crossed the space in stumbling steps, and did the only thing I could think of. I screamed, "Behind you! Commander! Behind you!" My voice, high and sharp with terror, cut through the chaos just enough. Ronan spun, his warrior instincts responding to the warning even as his eyes widened in shock at seeing me, a small Omega in a gray dress, standing in the middle of a battlefield. His blade came up just in time to deflect the killing blow meant for his spine. The force of the impact drove him backward, but he was alive, already moving into a counterattack that would end his would-be assassin. I'd done it. I'd actually helped. The thought had barely formed when someone grabbed me from behind, an arm like an iron bar wrapping around my waist, yanking me off my feet. I thrashed instinctively, my hands clawing at the arm that held me, my voice releasing another scream that was cut off by a hand clamping over my mouth. "Quiet, little Omega," a voice hissed against my ear, rough and amused. "You've caused quite enough trouble tonight." He was dragging me backward, toward the shattered eastern wall, toward the opening that led outside where more attackers probably waited. I could smell the wrongness on him, sweat and old blood and something chemical that didn't belong in a wolf's scent. My Omega instincts screamed in warning, my body trying desperately to make itself smaller, to submit, to survive. But submission meant capture, and capture meant leverage against the king I'd tried to warn. I bit down on the hand covering my mouth, tasting blood and feeling satisfaction as the man cursed and loosened his grip just enough. "She's biting me. Little bitch, actually." His words ended in a wet gurgle. I fell forward as his grip released entirely, hitting the ground hard enough to skin my palms on broken stone. When I twisted to look back, I saw the man who'd held me collapsing with a blade protruding from his throat, and behind him stood Luna Seraphine. Her perfect hair was disheveled now, her emerald dress torn at the hem, but her hand held the ceremonial dagger that should have been purely decorative. Blood dripped from its edge, dark in the flickering light. Our eyes met across the body, and for a moment I saw something in her expression that I couldn't name. Surprise, calculation, perhaps the barest hint of respect. "Thank you," I gasped, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. Her attention had already shifted, tracking the movements of the fight with the tactical awareness of someone trained for war, not just ceremony. She moved toward the main cluster of defenders, her blade ready, her body settling into a fighter's stance that spoke of extensive training. Whatever else she might be, she wasn't running, wasn't hiding, wasn't acting like someone who'd orchestrated this attack, which meant I'd been wrong about part of the conspiracy, or the trap had been sprung prematurely, before she could distance herself from the violence. A roar split the air, not human, not quite wolf, but something in between that made every instinct in my body freeze in primal recognition. I turned to see Caspian in partial transformation, his form larger, his features sharper, his eyes burning with silver fire. He'd torn through half the attacking force already, but more kept coming, pouring through the broken wall like an endless tide. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. This was a full assault, meant to kill not just the king, but everyone who might stand with him. "Fall back to the inner chambers," Ronan's voice carried above the chaos, directing the defenders toward the narrow corridors that branched from the main hall. "Defensive formation. Protect the civilians." The royal guard moved immediately, herding the panicked nobles toward relative safety, their bodies forming moving barriers against the attackers. But the doorways were bottlenecks, and people were jamming up in their terror, creating perfect targets. I saw an elderly woman fall, trampled in the crush. Saw a young beta male trying to protect his mate get cut down by an attacker's blade. Saw the moment when the careful defensive plan began to crumble under the weight of chaos and fear. Someone needed to organize the civilians. Someone needed to guide them to safety before the corridors became death traps. And the someone standing closest to the panicked crowd, small enough to slip through the press of bodies, insignificant enough that attackers might overlook her in favor of more dangerous targets, was me. I ran toward the nearest doorway, ducking under a swing meant for someone else, my small size an advantage for the first time in my life. "This way!" I shouted, grabbing the arm of a terrified Omega female frozen in panic. "Come on, move! Stay low and move!" She followed, and others followed her, responding to the command in my voice. Even though I had no authority to give commands, I pushed through the doorway into the corridor beyond, pulling people with me, directing them away from the main fighting toward the servants' passages I knew from my work in the healing halls. "Where are we going?" someone demanded, a beta male with fear bright in his eyes. "The eastern wing," I said, my mind racing through the castle's layout. "There's a servants' exit that leads to the gardens, then beyond the walls, small enough that attackers won't think to block it." More people crowded into the corridor behind us, a river of terrified bodies seeking safety. I kept moving, kept calling directions, my voice raw from shouting but not stopping. Behind us, the sounds of fighting continued, steel on steel, screams, the terrible wet sounds of violence finding its mark. I tried not to think about whether Caspian was still standing, whether Ronan had survived, whether Seraphine's moment of mercy meant something or nothing. We turned a corner and nearly ran straight into 3 attackers who'd apparently had the same idea about flanking through the side corridors. The crowd behind me gasped, recoiling, and I felt the crush of bodies trying to reverse direction in a space too narrow for turning. We were trapped, caught between the attackers ahead and the press of people behind, with nowhere to go and no weapons to fight with. The lead attacker grinned behind his mask, raising his blade. Well, well. A whole group of rabbits already cornered. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might shatter bone. But I didn't move. Couldn't move backward without sending the people behind me into a panic that would get them killed. Couldn't move forward without dying, so I stood there, tiny and terrified, and completely inadequate, and did the only thing I could think of. I screamed again. Not words this time, but pure sound. The kind of sound that carries, that alerts, that says help needed here, now, urgently. The attacker laughed. "Scream all you want, little..." A blade erupted from his chest, cutting off his words and his breath in the same moment. He crumpled, revealing the figure behind him. Ronan stood there, blood-spattered and breathing hard, 2 more royal guards flanking him. They made short work of the remaining attackers while I stood frozen, my scream dying in my throat, my whole body shaking with delayed terror. "Smart thinking, girl," Ronan said gruffly, his eyes taking in the crowd of civilians I'd been leading. "Using the servants' passages, get them out. We'll hold this corridor." "Is the king," I started. "Alive, fighting. Now go." I went, leading my frightened charges deeper into the passages, downstairs and through doorways that most nobles had probably never noticed existed. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the handles, but I kept moving, kept directing, kept doing the only useful thing I could in a situation where I was otherwise completely powerless. We emerged into the cold night air through a small door hidden behind rose bushes in the eastern garden. The same garden where I'd overheard the conspiracy, I realized with an odd sense of symmetry. Behind us, the castle blazed with light and echoed with sounds of continuing battle. But out here, the night was clear and quiet, the moon hanging full and bright overhead, indifferent to the violence below. I counted heads as people streamed past me. 23, 24, 25, all alive, all safe, at least for the moment. "Keep moving," I urged them, gesturing toward the tree line beyond the formal gardens. "Head for the village. Don't stop until you're well clear of the castle grounds." "What about you?" the Omega female I'd first grabbed asked, her eyes wide and grateful. I looked back at the castle, at the broken wall and the flickering lights visible through gaps in the stone. "I have to go back." "Are you insane?" the beta male demanded. "You'll be killed." "Probably. Almost certainly. But the thought of running, of hiding in the forest while others fought and died, made something in my chest twist painfully. I'd spent 3 months being invisible, being useless, being the rejected Omega who wasn't good enough for anything important. Tonight, I'd saved a commander's life. I'd led 24 people to safety. I'd done something that mattered. And there were still people inside who might need help. Still wounded who might need healing. Still a battle raging that would determine the future of everyone I'd ever known. I couldn't just run. "I'm going back," I repeated firmly. "You all get to safety." "That's an order." I turned before anyone could argue further, before my courage could fail, and ran back toward the small door, back toward the chaos, back toward a king I barely knew and a future I couldn't predict. Back toward the only choice that let me live with myself, even if I didn't live through it. The corridor was empty when I slipped back inside, the royal guards having moved to reinforce other positions. I could hear fighting echoing from multiple directions now, making it impossible to determine where the main battle had shifted. The smart thing would have been to head for the healing halls, to make myself useful tending wounds rather than risking the combat zones, but something pulled me back toward the grand hall. Some instinct I couldn't name. Some need to see how this ended, to know if my warning had been enough or if I'd simply changed the shape of the catastrophe without preventing it. I moved through corridors filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. Something had caught fire, adding a new layer of urgency to everything. My soft shoes made no sound on the stone floors, and twice I hid in alcoves as groups of fighters rushed past, too focused on their objectives to notice one small Omega pressed into the shadows. When I finally reached the entrance to the grand hall, what I saw made my breath catch. The battle was ending. Bodies littered the floor, attackers mostly, their dark clothing stark against the pale stone. The defensive line had held barely, and now the remaining attackers were being systematically subdued by royal guards who moved with grim efficiency. And in the center of it all, standing before his throne with a blade in each hand, and blood painting his arms to the elbows, stood Caspian Silverthorn. He was magnificent and terrible, power incarnate, a king who'd proven exactly why he held his crown. His silver eyes swept the hall, cataloging losses and survivors, already planning next moves and consequences. Those eyes found me in the doorway, and the world seemed to narrow to just that connection, his gaze and mine, across a hall full of death and survival, recognition passing between us that went beyond words. He'd survived. The warning had been enough, barely to prepare him for what came, and now he knew exactly who'd given it. I didn't know if that would save me or doom me, if gratitude or suspicion would win out in whatever came next. But as his expression shifted into something I couldn't read, something complex and considering, I realized my life had just changed in ways I couldn't begin to predict. The invisible Omega had been seen, and there was no going back to the shadows now. They held me in a room that was too fine to be a cell, but too stark to be comfortable. Stone walls softened by tapestries depicting ancient battles, a single window showing the gray light of early dawn, and a chair where I'd been sitting for what felt like hours while my mind replayed the night's violence in nauseating loops. No one had hurt me. That was the surprising part. After the battle ended, after the last attacker had been either subdued or eliminated, a female guard with kind eyes had simply escorted me here, told me to rest, and locked the door from the outside. Not chains, not threats, just waiting. I didn't know if I was a prisoner or a witness. Didn't know if they were protecting me or containing me until they decided what to do with the Omega who disrupted a sacred ceremony and somehow known about an attack before it happened. My hands still shook when I held them up to the morning light streaming through the window. I could still feel the ghost of that attacker's arm around my waist, still taste the copper tang of his blood when I'd bitten down, still hear the wet sound of Seraphine's blade finding its mark. I'd seen people die last night, had helped kill one, indirectly, had led others to safety, while more died in corridors I'd never know about. The girl who'd existed yesterday, the invisible, rejected Omega who sorted herbs and tried not to cause trouble, felt like a stranger's memory. A key turned in the lock, and I straightened instinctively, my body responding to a lifetime of conditioning that said appear smaller, seem harmless, don't provoke. The door opened to reveal not a guard, but Commander Ronan himself, his formal armor replaced by simple fighting leathers, his weathered face bearing fresh bruises, and a cut above one eye that someone had stitched with neat precision. "You're awake," he said, his gruff voice somehow gentler than I'd expected. "Good. The king wants to see you." My stomach dropped. "Now?" "Now." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to follow. "Don't worry. You're not in trouble. Quite the opposite, actually." I didn't believe him. Couldn't afford to believe him. But I stood and followed anyway, because refusing a direct summons from the Alpha King was not an option for anyone, let alone an Omega with no pack status and no protection. The castle looked different in daylight, the violence of the previous night already being erased by an army of servants who scrubbed blood from stone and replaced shattered furniture with pristine replacements. But the broken eastern wall remained, a gaping wound that let cold morning air flow freely through the grand hall, and workers swarmed over it with scaffolding and stone, already beginning repairs. I counted 12 bodies being carried out on litters, covered with white cloths, 12 dead, and those were just the ones I could see from this corridor. How many more had fallen in other parts of the castle? How many families would wake today to find their loved ones gone? 17 total, Ronan said quietly, noticing my attention. 8 guards, 9 civilians. Could have been much worse. Would have been, if someone hadn't raised the alarm when she did. I didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know if those 17 deaths were fewer because of my warning, or if I'd somehow caused them by forcing the conspirators to act prematurely. The weight of it sat heavy in my chest, making breathing difficult. Ronan led me through corridors I'd never seen before, deeper into the castle's administrative heart, where the real work of ruling happened away from ceremonial spaces. We passed offices where exhausted-looking officials worked over maps and documents, a war room where military leaders debated defensive positions, and finally stopped before a set of heavy oak doors, carved with the kingdom's wolf and moon sigil. "A few things before you go in," Ronan said, turning to face me with an expression that was part warning, part advice. "First, the king is not what you might expect. Don't let the reputation frighten you into stupidity. Second, tell the truth. Always. He values honesty above courtesy. And third, he paused, something almost like respect flickering in his eyes. Don't sell yourself short, girl. What you did last night took more courage than most warriors show in a lifetime. Before I could process that, he knocked twice and pushed the doors open. The room beyond was clearly a private study, lined with books and maps, dominated by a massive desk covered in reports and correspondence. But what captured my attention immediately was the man standing by the window, his back to the door, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. Caspian Silverthorn had washed the blood away, changed into clean clothes, simple dark pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. But he still carried the aftermath of battle in the tension of his shoulders and the way his hand rested near a blade even here, in his own private space. Your Majesty, Ronan said formally, the Omega, as requested. Caspian didn't turn immediately. Thank you, Ronan. Leave us. And ensure we're not disturbed. Something in that command made my pulse quicken. Being alone with the Alpha King, after everything that had happened, felt dangerous in ways I couldn't articulate. But Ronan simply bowed and withdrew, the doors closing with a soft finality that made me acutely aware of how small the room suddenly felt. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sounds of reconstruction drifting through the window. I stood there, hands clasped in front of me to hide their shaking, eyes fixed on the floor, waiting. Finally he spoke. Look at me. It was a command, gentle but absolute. I forced my gaze upward, past the desk and the scattered papers, until I met those silver eyes that had haunted my nightmares and now studied me with an intensity that felt like being dissected. Up close, with the ceremonial distance removed, I could see details I'd missed before. The thin scar that traced his left cheekbone, the strands of gray that threaded through his dark hair at the temples, the exhaustion that lived in the corners of his eyes, the kind that came from years of bearing impossible weight. He looked older than the legend suggested, and somehow, that made him seem more real, more human beneath the armor of authority. What's your name? He asked. Of all the questions I'd expected, that one caught me off guard. Ilara, Your Majesty, Ilara Ashwin. Ilara. He repeated it slowly, as if tasting the syllables. Tell me, Ilara Ashwin, why does an Omega with no apparent connection to court politics risk her life to warn a king she's never spoken to? Because it was the right thing to do, I said simply. Then, because Ronan's advice about honesty echoed in my mind, I added, and because I couldn't live with myself if I'd stayed silent and people died. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. You overheard the conspiracy 2 nights ago in the gardens behind the Luna's chambers. That much I've pieced together from your note and the timing. But what were you doing there? The question held no accusation, just curiosity, but I felt heat rise to my cheeks anyway. Walking. The night-blooming jasmine grows thick there, and the scent, it reminds me of my mother. I wasn't spying. I didn't mean to hear anything, but you did hear. And rather than dismiss it as none of your concern, or fear the consequences of speaking up, you chose to act. He moved away from the window, closer, and I had to fight the urge to step back. Do you know how rare that is? How many people, faced with dangerous knowledge, choose comfortable silence over risky truth? I don't know anything about politics, Your Majesty, I admitted. I couldn't let it happen, not without trying. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could smell pine and winter on him, close enough that my Omega instincts registered his dominance like a physical pressure. But instead of the fear that usually accompanied such proximity to powerful alphas, I felt something else, something that made no sense. Safety. You saved more than my life last night, Caspian said quietly. Your warning gave us seconds, barely that, but enough to position guards differently. Enough to have weapons ready instead of being caught completely unprepared. Commander Ronan tells me you also led 24 civilians to safety through the servants' passages, then came back into danger. Why come back? I'm a healer's assistant, I said. Or I was trying to be one. I thought there might be wounded who needed help. A healer's assistant. Something in his tone suggested he was fitting pieces together. The Omega quarters. You work in the healing halls, but they don't let you near patients. Why not? The question cut too close to rejection, to shame I'd tried to bury. I looked away, unable to hold his gaze while speaking the words. I was rejected 3 months ago. By Demon Corvus, son of the Eastern Territories Alpha. The senior healers said. They said rejected Omegas are unstable, unreliable, not fit for important work. Demon Corvus. Caspian's voice went cold. I know him. Arrogant whelp who inherited his position and thinks birthright equals capability. And he rejected you. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. Look at me, Alara. I did, reluctantly, expecting to see pity or dismissal. Instead, I found something that looked almost like anger, not at me, but on my behalf. That man is a fool, Caspian said flatly, and every person who let his rejection define your worth is equally foolish. Last night, while nobles and warriors panicked, while trained fighters fell into chaos, you kept your head. You thought strategically, you acted decisively, you saved lives through quick thinking and courage most would never find. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried absolute certainty. You are not unstable or unreliable. You are exactly the kind of person this kingdom needs. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking something loose in my chest that I hadn't realized was lodged there. Tears burned behind my eyes, and I blinked rapidly, refusing to cry in front of the Alpha King, refusing to prove the weakness everyone already assumed lived in me. Thank you, Your Majesty, I whispered, not trusting my voice for anything louder. He turned away, giving me a moment to compose myself, moving back to his desk where he picked up a document and studied it with apparent focus. The investigation into last night's attack is ongoing. We've captured 3 conspirators alive and they're being questioned. What we've learned so far suggests the plot was more extensive than a simple assassination. They wanted to destabilize the entire kingdom, create chaos that would allow certain factions to seize power in the aftermath. The Luna, I started, then stopped, unsure if I should voice suspicions about the king's chosen mate, is innocent, Caspian finished for me. Seraphine knew nothing about the attack. In fact, she fought well once the violence started. Saved your life, I understand. She did, I confirmed, remembering the blood on that ceremonial blade, the calculation in green eyes. I thought. When I heard the voices, one was female, and I assumed. The female voice belonged to Lady Helena Ashford, Seraphine's chief attendant and supposed friend. She's among the captured. Seraphine is not taking the betrayal well. There was something in his tone, some reservation that made me wonder about the relationship between the king and his Luna, but that was far above my position to question. Caspian set down the document and faced me again. I'm faced with a problem, Ilara. You've demonstrated loyalty, intelligence, and courage. You've also made yourself a target. The conspirators who survived will know you're the one who warned me. They're allies, and we haven't identified them all yet, will want you silenced. Keeping you in the Omega quarters, vulnerable and unprotected, would be unconscionable. Fear spiked through me. What are you saying? I'm saying I want you here, in the castle proper, under royal protection. There are positions that need filling. Intelligent people I can trust are rare enough that I can't afford to waste one when she appears. His gaze held mine, serious and assessing. I'm offering you a place as my personal assistant. You'd help coordinate information, manage communications, assist with administrative tasks that require discretion. The work would be demanding, sometimes dangerous, and you'd be operating far above your current station, which will cause resentment among those who think rank should be inherited rather than earned. My mind reeled, trying to process what he was proposing. An Omega, especially a rejected Omega, didn't just get elevated to positions of real authority. It didn't happen. It couldn't happen. Why? I asked bluntly. Why would you risk the political complications of promoting someone like me? Because you're capable. Because I need people who act based on principle rather than politics. And because... He paused, something complex crossing his features. Because I'm tired of pretending that the old hierarchies serve anyone except those already in power. You proved your worth last night in ways that matter more than bloodlines or pack status. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept the consequences of being recognized for it. I thought about the healing halls, about sorting herbs while others did the real work. About 3 months of being invisible, dismissed, defined by a rejection that had carved out my sense of self-worth. About standing in the grand hall last night, terrified and tiny, and choosing to act anyway. I accept, I said, the words emerging stronger than I'd expected. Whatever the work requires, whatever the consequences, I accept. Something that might have been approval flickered in those silver eyes. Good. You'll move to new quarters today. Ronan will assign you a personal guard until we're certain all the conspirators are identified. And Alara... He moved closer again, and this time I didn't fight the urge to look up at him. The role I'm giving you is real. This isn't charity or protection disguised as employment. I genuinely need someone I can trust, and trust is something that must be earned through action, not granted through birthright. You've earned mine. Don't make me regret it. I won't, Your Majesty, I promised, meaning it with every fiber of my being. He nodded once, decisive, then moved toward the door. Ronan will handle the details. For now, get some rest. Tomorrow the real work begins. He was almost to the door when I found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in my mind since I'd first written that warning. Your Majesty, why did you notice me last night, in the hall, before everything happened? I was just another Omega in the crowd. What made you look? Caspian paused with his hand on the door handle, his profile sharp against the light. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange quality I couldn't interpret. I don't know. Something about you called attention, even when you were trying to disappear, as if part of me recognized something important, even before I understood what it was. He left before I could respond, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. I stood there in his study, surrounded by the maps and books and documents that represented the weight of a kingdom, and realized my life had just transformed in ways that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. The rejected Omega had been given a second chance. I intended to prove worthy of it. 3 weeks passed in a blur of learning and adaptation that left me exhausted and exhilarated in turns. My new quarters were located in the castle's west wing, far removed from the Omega dormitories where I'd spent the last 3 months in communal simplicity. The room assigned to me was modest by noble standards, but felt impossibly luxurious compared to what I'd known. A proper bed with thick blankets, a desk positioned near the window for working, shelves already filling with documents and reference materials, and most importantly, a door that locked from the inside. Privacy, safety, space to breathe. Senna had visited on the second day, her eyes wide as she took in my new circumstances. I can't believe this is real, she'd whispered, perching on the edge of my bed like she was afraid to disturb anything. They're saying you saved the king, that you're working directly for him now. Alara, do you understand how unprecedented this is? I'd understood. Every sneering look from high-ranking betas, every whispered comment about that Omega who thinks she's more than she is. Every subtle attempt to undermine or exclude me from meetings reminded me exactly how unprecedented my position was. But Caspian had meant what he said about the work being real. He'd thrown me into the deep end of kingdom administration without apology or coddling. My days started before dawn and often stretched past midnight, filled with reviewing reports from border patrols, coordinating communications between different pact territories, tracking supply lines and trade agreements, and maintaining the intricate schedule that kept a ruling monarch functioning across multiple domains of responsibility. It was overwhelming. It was impossibly complex, and I discovered, to my own surprise, that I was good at it. The skills that had made me useful in the healing halls, attention to detail, pattern recognition, the ability to prioritize and organize, translated perfectly to administrative work. I learned quickly which officials could be trusted with sensitive information and which needed careful handling. I developed systems for flagging urgent matters versus routine concerns. I became proficient at summarizing complex situations into brief, actionable reports that Caspian could digest between more pressing demands. And slowly, grudgingly, some of the initial hostility began to shift into something closer to acceptance. The Omega actually knows what she's doing. I'd overheard one official mutter to another, after I'd caught a discrepancy in territorial tax records that would have cost the Treasury significantly. Irritating but competent. I'd take competent. Competent was more than I'd been given credit for in years. Ronan had become an unexpected ally, his gruff exterior hiding a fairness I hadn't anticipated. He'd assigned me a guard named Petra, a beta female with sharp eyes and sharper instincts who took her protective duties seriously without making me feel imprisoned, and he'd started including me in tactical briefings, recognizing that my perspective sometimes caught details others missed. "You notice things," he'd said one afternoon after I'd pointed out an odd pattern in rogue sightings along the southern border. "Most people look at information and see what they expect. You see what's actually there. It's a rare skill." The conspiracy investigation had yielded disturbing results. Lady Helena, Seraphine's trusted attendant, had been working with a faction of nobles who believed Caspian's reign had become too progressive, too willing to challenge traditional hierarchies. They'd wanted him dead and replaced with someone more amenable to maintaining the old power structures, someone who would keep Omegas in their place, maintain rigid pack boundaries, and resist the social changes Caspian had been slowly implementing. 4 more conspirators had been identified and arrested, 2 had chosen exile over trial, and the Whisper Network suggested more remained hidden, biding their time, waiting for another opportunity, which meant I remained a target. The Omega who'd disrupted their plans and proven that rank didn't equal capability. Every success I had made me more dangerous to their worldview, more urgent to eliminate. Petra never let me forget it. She shadowed my movements with professional vigilance, screened everyone who approached me, and twice had intercepted threats that might have been serious, or might have been attempts to frighten me into withdrawing from my position. I refused to withdraw, refused to make myself smaller, or quieter, or more acceptable. If they wanted me gone, they'd have to work harder than anonymous threats. My relationship with Caspian evolved in unexpected ways. We worked closely, sometimes spending hours together reviewing documents or discussing policy implications, but there remained a careful distance between us. Professional boundaries that neither of us crossed, despite moments when I'd look up from my work to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't interpret. He was nothing like I'd expected. Yes, he could be harsh when circumstances demanded it, ruthless with enemies and intolerant of incompetence, but he was also fair, thoughtful, willing to listen to perspectives that challenged his own. He asked my opinion on matters and actually considered my input, even when it contradicted his initial assumptions. "You have good instincts," he'd told me one evening as we worked late in his study, the castle quiet around us. "You think about consequences beyond the immediate, about how decisions affect people at every level. That's not common among advisors who've spent their lives insulated from hardship." The comment had felt personal, exposing something vulnerable beneath his authoritative exterior. I'd wanted to ask about his own hardships, the experiences that had shaped a king who genuinely seemed to care about justice over tradition. But the moment passed, and the professional distance reasserted itself before I found the courage. Luna Seraphine remained an enigma. She'd moved through the aftermath of the attack with practiced grace, her betrayal by Helena handled privately, her public demeanor never cracking to reveal whatever turmoil existed beneath. She was cordial to me when our paths crossed. Polite, distant, neither hostile nor warm. But I'd noticed things, the way she and Caspian rarely spoke beyond formal necessity, the absence of physical affection between them, even the casual touches that bonded couples naturally displayed, the separate chambers, separate schedules, separate lives that happened to occasionally intersect for ceremonial purposes. Whatever their relationship was, it wasn't a love match, and increasingly, I wondered if the lunar binding ceremony had ever been completed, or if it remained suspended by the violence that had interrupted it. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place, and yet the question haunted quiet moments, making me wonder things I had no right to wonder. The 4th week brought new complications in the form of a diplomatic summit. Representatives from all the major pact territories were converging on the castle to discuss trade agreements, border disputes, and the security implications of the recent assassination attempt. It would be the largest gathering since the attack, requiring extensive preparation and coordination, which meant I was drowning in arrangements. "Seating charts need to account for blood feuds going back 3 generations, I muttered to Petra, as I stared at the nightmare of diplomatic requirements spread across my desk. The coastal pacts refuse to sit near the mountain territories. The Eastern contingent demands proximity to the king, but can't be placed anywhere near the Western Alliance, and everyone wants precedence over everyone else. "Welcome to pack politics," Petra said dryly from her position by the door, "where ancient grudges matter more than present reality." A knock interrupted my frustrated attempts to make impossible seating work. Petra checked the corridor before admitting Commander Ronan, who looked even more tired than usual. "Problem," he announced without preamble. "The Eastern Territories are sending Demon Corvus as part of their delegation." The name hit me like cold water, freezing my thoughts midstream. My hand stilled on the document I'd been annotating, and I felt Petra's attention sharpen on me even though I didn't look up. "That's unfortunate timing," I managed, keeping my voice steady through effort of will. "It's a calculated insult," Ronan growled. "His father knows exactly what message he's sending by including Demon in the delegation. They're testing the king's commitment to you, seeing if having your rejection present will make you falter, or if Caspian will remove you to avoid the awkwardness." "I'm not faltering," I said firmly, finally looking up to meet Ronan's eyes. "And I'm certainly not hiding. If Demon wants to attend the summit, that's his right as an Eastern representative. My personal history with him doesn't change my professional responsibilities." Something that might have been approval flickered across Ronan's weathered face. "That's what I told the king you'd say. He wanted to bar Demon from attending, but I said you'd probably prefer to face it directly rather than let people think you need protection from an ex-mate." "You were correct." I turned back to my seating chart with renewed determination. "Though I will ensure Demon is seated as far from the head table as diplomatic protocol allows. That's just practical planning." Ronan chuckled roughly. "Indeed. I'll inform His Majesty you're handling it. Try to get some sleep, girl. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." He left, and I stared at the documents without seeing them, my mind churning through implications and emotions I'd thought I'd buried months ago. Demon. Here. In 3 days. I'd managed to avoid thinking about him much during the chaos of my new position. Rejection hurt less when buried under important work and genuine purpose. But now the wound felt fresh again, exposing the girl who'd been deemed insufficient, unworthy, lacking whatever essential quality made someone mate material. "You okay?" Petra asked quietly. "I will be," I said, meaning it. He rejected me. That hurt. But it also freed me to become this. I gestured at the organized chaos of my work, and I wouldn't trade this for anything, even if it meant still having a mate. The words felt true as I spoke them. Whatever pain Demon had caused, it had also broken open a future I'd never have pursued otherwise. I'd never have risked approaching the king, never have discovered my capability for this kind of work, never have found purpose beyond being someone's omega. I'd been rejected. And it had led me here, to work that mattered, to respect earned rather than given, to a life that felt like mine in ways the previous path never had. The irony wasn't lost on me. The next 3 days blurred into controlled chaos. Delegations arrived in waves, each requiring welcoming ceremonies, chamber assignments, briefings on summit protocol, and careful management of egos and expectations. I coordinated it all, working alongside the castle's diplomatic staff, troubleshooting problems as they emerged, and somehow keeping the entire complex operation from dissolving into political disaster. I saw Demon arrive with the Eastern contingent on the afternoon before the summit's formal opening. I was in the main courtyard, checking transportation arrangements, when their party rode through the gates. He looked exactly as I remembered, handsome in that aristocratic way. Dark hair perfectly styled, his bearing confident and entitled. He was laughing at something another delegate said, his expression carefree, showing no sign that being in this castle might affect him at all. Our eyes met across the courtyard for just a moment. I saw recognition flicker across his face, followed by surprise, and then something that might have been discomfort. But I didn't look away, didn't duck my head submissively, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me diminished. Instead, I held his gaze for 3 steady heartbeats, then deliberately turned back to my conversation with the stable master, dismissing Demon as thoroughly as he'd once dismissed me. It felt powerful, freeing. like closing a door that had been hanging open too long. "That him?" Petra murmured when the Eastern delegation had moved past toward their assigned quarters. "That's him," I confirmed. "He looks like an ass." I couldn't help the surprised laugh that escaped. "Petra." "What? He does. Self-important and oblivious," she shook her head. "His loss. King's gain. That's how I see it." Her casual loyalty warmed something in my chest. "Thank you. Just truth." She scanned the courtyard with professional alertness. "Come on. You've got the final security briefing in an hour, and you still need to eat something before then." The summit's opening ceremony took place that evening in the Grand Hall, now fully repaired, the eastern wall restored to its former glory with stone that was slightly lighter in color, a permanent reminder of the attack that had failed to break the kingdom. I stood in my assigned position near the administrative staff, my simple blue dress appropriate for my role without drawing unnecessary attention. From here, I could observe the entire gathering, dozens of pack leaders and their representatives, the kingdom's nobles and officials, all assembled in careful arrangement that reflected years of tradition and contemporary political reality. Caspian presided from his throne, magnificent in formal regalia, his presence dominating the space without effort. Seraphine sat beside him in the Luna's seat, equally elegant, playing her role with practiced perfection. And somewhere in the middle ranks of delegates, Demon Corvus sat with the Eastern contingent, his attention focused forward on the ceremony, seemingly oblivious to my presence. Good, let him stay oblivious. I had more important things to think about than a male who'd thrown away something valuable because he couldn't see past traditional expectations. The ceremony proceeded smoothly. Speeches about unity and cooperation, formal acknowledgments of territorial boundaries and mutual respect, the carefully choreographed diplomacy that kept a fractious collection of packs functioning as something resembling a kingdom. I was mentally reviewing tomorrow's schedule when I felt it, a wrongness in the air, a disturbance too subtle for most to notice but sharp as a blade against my senses. Someone in the hall shouldn't be here. My eyes swept the crowd, tracking movements and positions, searching for whatever had triggered my instinct. There, a servant moving along the eastern wall, his path taking him closer to the dais than protocol permitted, his posture wrong for someone attending to routine duties. His hand moved toward his belt, and I saw the glint of metal. Time seemed to slow. I could have stayed silent, stayed safe, let someone else notice or not notice. Could have remembered that getting involved last time had changed my entire life, and that lightning rarely struck the same place twice. But the memory of 17 bodies carried out on white litters made the choice impossible. I moved forward, my voice cutting through the ceremonial speeches with desperate urgency. "Weapon! There's a weapon!" The hall erupted into instant chaos as guards converged on the servant who'd frozen at my shout, his cover blown. He tried to run, tried to raise whatever he'd been reaching for, but royal guards were faster, tackling him to the ground in a coordinated rush. And I found myself, once again, standing in the center of attention I'd never wanted, breathing hard with the aftermath of adrenaline, my heart pounding against my ribs. Caspian was on his feet, his eyes finding mine across the distance with an intensity that felt like physical contact. In that look, I saw recognition, gratitude, and something else, something deeper that made my breath catch. Twice now. Twice I'd warned him, spotted threats others missed. The invisible Omega who kept saving the king. The irony would have been funny if my hands weren't shaking so badly. The interrogation revealed what we'd all feared. The conspirators hadn't given up. The servant had been a sleeper agent, planted months ago, waiting for the perfect moment when security would be focused on external threats, rather than internal ones. He'd carried a poisoned blade. One cut would have been enough. The summit continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The delegates who'd viewed my presence with skepticism or condescension now looked at me differently, with wariness, respect, or in some cases fear. The Omega who'd twice prevented assassination attempts had become something they couldn't easily dismiss or ignore. Demon approached me on the summit's final evening. I was in one of the side chambers, organizing documents for closing ceremonies, when he appeared in the doorway. Petra moved to intercept, but I waved her back. This conversation had been inevitable since the moment he'd arrived. "Ilara," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of practiced charm. "I was hoping we could talk." "We are talking," I replied neutrally, not looking up from my work. "Was there something specific you needed?" "I wanted to." He paused, seeming uncertain for perhaps the first time I'd ever witnessed. "I wanted to say that I was wrong about us, about you. Seeing what you've accomplished here, how you've risen to such an important position, I realize I misjudged badly." I finally looked at him, really looked, and felt nothing. No lingering love, no residual hurt, just the mild interest one might have for a stranger. "You didn't misjudge me, demon. You just valued the wrong things. You wanted an Omega who'd fit perfectly into the life you'd already planned, and I understand that. It's what you were taught to want, but I was never going to be that person." "I can see that now," he said, stepping closer. "Which is why I'm hoping we might reconsider, start fresh." I spoke to my father, and he agrees that a formal mating with someone in your current position would actually benefit our territory significantly. "No." The word came out flat and final. He blinked, clearly not expecting such immediate rejection, but I thought, "You thought I'd be grateful," I finished for him. "That being wanted now, after proving myself worthy by your standards, would erase the rejection you dealt me when I was just an ordinary Omega. But here's what you don't understand, demon. I don't need your reconsideration. I don't need validation from someone who only sees my value in terms of political advantage. That's not... I do care about you," he protested. But the words rang hollow. "Maybe you do, in your way. But caring isn't enough when it comes with conditions." I set down my documents and faced him fully. "You rejected me when I was vulnerable and needed support. That was your right, and I don't hate you for it. But I've built a life beyond that rejection. Discovered purpose I'd never have found otherwise. I'm not interested in going backward to fit into the space you originally decided I wasn't good enough to fill." He stared at me like I'd spoken a language he couldn't comprehend. In his world, Omegas didn't refuse advantageous matches, didn't choose independence over security, didn't walk away from second chances with high-ranking alphas. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, his tone hardening with wounded pride. "Perhaps," I acknowledged. "But it's my mistake to make. Goodbye, demon. I hope you find what you're looking for." I turned back to my work, and after a long moment, I heard his footsteps retreat. The door closed, and Petra let out a low whistle. "That was satisfying to witness," she admitted. "It was, wasn't it?" I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Come on. We have closing ceremonies to prepare." The summit concluded successfully despite the security breach, or perhaps because of it. Nothing unified fractious pacts quite like a shared external threat. Agreements were signed, alliances reinforced, and delegates departed with renewed commitment to the kingdom's stability. I worked late into the night after the last delegation left, catching up on tasks that had been delayed during the summit chaos. The castle felt quiet, almost peaceful, in the aftermath of so much concentrated activity. I was finishing a report when my door opened without warning. I looked up, startled, to find Caspian standing in the doorway. He'd dismissed his formal attire for simple clothes, and exhaustion lined his face. "Your Majesty." I started to rise, but he waved me back to my seat. "We need to talk, Ilara." He closed the door behind him, and something in his tone made my heart rate quicken. "About what happens next." "Next?" I echoed uncertainly. He moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit grounds. "Twice now, you've saved my life. You've proven yourself invaluable, not just as an assistant, but as someone whose instincts I've come to trust implicitly. The kingdom owes you a debt that can't be repaid with a position or protection." "I don't want repayment," I said honestly. "I just want to keep doing work that matters." "I know, which is part of why..." He turned to face me, and the intensity in his silver eyes made breathing difficult. The Luna binding was never completed. Seraphine and I discussed it during the summit. We've agreed to dissolve the betrothal by mutual consent. She deserves a mate who can love her properly, and He paused, something vulnerable crossing his features. "I can't be that for her, not when my attention is constantly drawn elsewhere." My mouth went dry. Elsewhere? He crossed the room slowly, deliberately, giving me time to understand, to object, to retreat if I wanted. He stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. You walked into my life uninvited and turned everything upside down, he said quietly. Made me question assumptions I'd held for decades, made me see possibilities I'd dismissed as impossible. An Omega with no pack status, no political connections, no apparent advantage. And yet you're the person I trust most in this entire kingdom. Caspian, I whispered, his name feeling dangerous on my lips without the formal title. I'm not demon, he continued firmly. I'm not asking you to reconsider or offering you a second chance at something that failed. I'm offering you something completely new. Partnership. Not because you've proven yourself worthy by political standards, but because you're exactly who you are. Brave, intelligent, compassionate, and stubborn enough to risk everything for what you believe is right. His hand came up slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, and cupped my cheek with unexpected gentleness. I'm asking if you'd consider letting this king who's spent decades maintaining careful distance try something terrifying and new. Letting himself feel something real. Tears pricked my eyes. You don't have to do this. I'm happy with what I have. I know you are, which is exactly why I'm asking. His thumb brushed my cheekbone softly. You don't need me to complete you or validate your worth. You've built your own purpose, your own strength. But maybe we could build something together that's stronger than either of us alone. I thought about the girl who'd stood in the shadows 3 months ago, invisible and rejected, convinced her value had died with Demon's words. Thought about the woman I'd become, capable, respected, no longer defined by someone else's assessment. And I thought about the man before me, who'd seen past rank and tradition to recognize what actually mattered, who'd given me opportunity when others saw only limitations, who looked at me now not with pity or condescension, but with genuine regard that made my heart race. Yes, I breathed. Yes, I'd like to try. His smile transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. Thank God. I was prepared to make a much longer argument. I laughed, the sound shaky with emotion and relief. You're the Alpha King. Did you really think I'd refuse? I hoped you wouldn't. But you've surprised me at every turn, Alara Ashwin. I wouldn't have been shocked if you'd listed perfectly logical reasons why this was a terrible idea. His other hand came up to frame my face, his touch reverent. May I kiss you? The question, so carefully asked despite his authority, made something in my chest crack open completely. Please. He kissed me like I was precious, like I might break, until I pressed closer and showed him I was stronger than I looked. The kiss deepened, becoming less careful, more real. A promise of partnership that went beyond politics or duty into something genuine and chosen. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. This won't be easy. There will be resistance, political complications, people who think an Omega can't be queen. Let them think what they want, I interrupted firmly. We'll prove them wrong. Together. Together, he agreed, and the word felt like a vow. The months that followed brought exactly the challenges he'd predicted. Opposition from traditionalists, whispered scandals, political maneuvering from those who saw my rise as threatening their own positions. But we faced it all together. A king who'd chosen strength of character over bloodline, and an Omega who'd refused to let rejection define her limits. The lunar binding ceremony, when it finally happened 6 months later, was different from the interrupted disaster of that first attempt. Smaller, more intimate, filled with people who genuinely supported what we represented rather than just performing obligation. As I walked down the aisle toward Caspian, wearing simple elegance rather than elaborate display, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Rejection that had broken me open. Fear that had driven me to act. Courage that had changed everything. I'd saved a king's life twice, and in return, he'd saved mine. Not from danger, but from a future too small to hold who I was becoming. When our hands joined and the ancient words were spoken, I felt the bond settle into place with rightness that had nothing to do with tradition, and everything to do with choice. His smile was private, meant only for me, full of promises about the future we'd build together. My queen, he murmured, as we sealed the bond with a kiss that felt like coming home. My king, I whispered back, and meant it with everything I was. The rejected Omega had become a queen. But more importantly, she'd become herself. Fully, completely, unapologetically, and that was the real happy ending.